Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The rain poured mercilessly, soaking the thin wrapper that clung to Ebube's trembling body as she stood barefoot at the imposing gate of the Okizi mansion. Her belly, swollen with the weight of a life she never asked for, rose and fell with every shaky breath. The guards didn't need instructions. They had been told she was a disgrace, a stain on the family's reputation. Chief Damian stood at the entrance, arms folded across his chest like a king passing judgment. "Let her rot where she belongs," he muttered, his voice sharp and cold. Behind him, Madame Clara paced furiously, her gold-bangled wrist slapping the air with each insult. "You dirty witch! You came here with nothing, and now you want to ruin my sons? Seducing everyone with those wild village eyes," she screamed. The mansion staff watched, not one daring to speak. And then, with one last shove from the guards, Ebube was thrown into the muddy road, the gate slamming shut behind her like a final sentence. As she fell to her knees in the dirt, her hands instinctively cradled her stomach, whispering a prayer not for herself, but for the unborn child now destined to enter a world that already hated them. Her hair, once neatly braided, was now soaked and matted to her forehead. The wind howled around her, but it was the silence in her heart that roared the loudest. She had given her all to this family, loyalty, innocence, and silent endurance. But none of it mattered. The moment she became inconvenient, she was thrown out like trash. Even as her body ached from the trauma, her spirit refused to break. She stared at the mansion through the rain and whispered with clenched teeth, "I may not have a name now, but this child will carry one the world will never forget." Hours passed before a stranger, a street hawker, spotted her curled up under a kiosk's torn umbrella. He offered her a sachet of water and a piece of bread without questions. For the first time in days, someone looked at her with pity, not disgust. She took the food, thanked him softly, and sat in silence. Around her, people bustled through the night, stepping over puddles and ignoring the drenched child who looked like a ghost. But something inside Ebube awakened that night, a whisper of defiance, a silent oath. She had no home, no family, no protection. But she had a child growing inside her. And for that child, she would rise again, one painful step at a time. The memory of that final night in the mansion burned through Ebube's mind like a fever. It had taken every drop of courage for her to approach Chief Damian in his study, trembling and clutching the test result in her hand. "Sir, I'm pregnant," she had whispered, her eyes lowered in fear. She never expected warmth, but what followed shattered whatever innocence she had left. His chair scraped loudly as he stood, grabbing her by the collar and dragging her toward the wall. "Pregnant? With what? Who gave you the right to open your filthy mouth in my house?" he spat, his hand slamming against her cheek so hard her ears rang. She fell, clutching the paper, tears spilling uncontrollably. "Was it the cook? One of the guards? Or you've been servicing everyone behind my back, you cursed girl," he continued, each word a lash on her soul. He tore the result and stormed out. Minutes later, Madame Clara and the boys barged in like a tribunal of devils, and the public humiliation began. Clara had always hated her. From the first day Ebube arrived as a fragile housemaid from the village, Clara had seen her as a threat, not because of what Ebube did, but because of who she was, young, humble, beautiful, in her quiet way. Clara, ever insecure, was quick to believe any tale that painted Ebube as immoral. So when the pregnancy was announced, she didn't ask questions. She dragged Ebube through the corridor like a criminal, yelling, "This is what I warned you about. That cursed child is a seductress. You boys are too innocent to see her for what she is." The boys, Brian and Dennis, stood at the top of the stairs, grinning as if watching a movie. The same boys who would corner her in the kitchen, push her against shelves, and whisper crude jokes in her ear now stood and watched her be condemned for sins she never committed. Ebube didn't speak a word. Her voice had been stolen long before. When the mansion gate shut behind her that night, so did the last bit of light she thought the world had. But as she sat that evening under a makeshift shelter, watching the moonlight dance in the puddles, she remembered her own mother, the woman she barely knew. "Life will always test you, child," her mother once said, "but if you fall, fall forward, so that when you rise you're already closer to where you must go." That memory was all she had now. No name, no clothes, no food, just the slow, rhythmic pulse of a child in her womb, and the voice of a dead mother whispering from somewhere deep inside her. And as she finally drifted to sleep on the hard cement floor, she clutched her belly and whispered, "You are not a curse, my child. You are the reason I will rise." The Okizi mansion was grand, its walls decorated with imported marble, its chandeliers imported from Italy, and its gardens trimmed to perfection. But to Ebube, it had always felt like a golden prison. She had arrived there at just 12 years old, sold into domestic work by a distant uncle after her parents died in a fire. From the very first day, she learned that her place was beneath the stairs, in the servant quarters, with rules carved in silence. Brian and Dennis, the billionaire sons, had welcomed her with mocking laughter. "She looks like she still drinks mud water," Brian had said, while Dennis had snatched her slippers and tossed them into the pond. The bullying never stopped. They made her kneel for hours if she didn't respond fast enough. Once, Dennis smeared pepper on her clothes, watching her cry in pain. Clara called it discipline. Even worse than the physical torment was the emotional one. They would corner her, play sick games, opening doors while she was bathing, locking her in dark rooms, and filming her reactions on their phones. When she mustered the courage to report them, Madame Clara had looked her straight in the eye and said, "You think because you're pretty you can manipulate my sons. You're just a rat from the gutters. Don't ever bring this foolishness to me again." That day, Clara slapped her with the same hand she used to wear gold rings, and the sting of that slap stayed with her for years. The staff kept silent. They had seen too many girls like Ebube come and go, broken, discarded, replaced. The mansion wasn't a home. It was a silent battlefield where the weak didn't survive. Ebube had learned to move like a shadow, quiet, invisible. She cleaned early, stayed out of sight, and never made eye contact. But no matter how much she disappeared, trouble found her. One day, Brian pinned her against the pantry door, whispering, "You think we don't see how you sway those hips? Don't play innocent." She shoved him off and fled, but he laughed, knowing she had no voice, no power. Damian saw everything, and said nothing. In that mansion, Ebube was not a girl. She was a shadow, an object, a ghost. But ghosts remember everything, and one day they return not to haunt, but to reveal the truth. There was a darkness in Chief Damian that Ebube could not put into words, but she felt it every time his eyes lingered longer than necessary, every time he spoke her name with that unnatural softness that made her spine stiffen. It started subtly. He would call her to his private study and ask her to polish the table that was already clean. He would offer her juice or a slice of cake, not like a father figure, but like a man slowly baiting a trap. At first, she thought he was just being kind. But then the small touches began, the lingering hand on her shoulder as she bent to dust a shelf, the slow brush of his fingers on her arm as he handed her a pen, the way he blocked the doorway with his body when she tried to leave. "You're different," he once murmured, his voice like silk soaked in poison. "You're not like the others." The way he said it made her stomach twist with dread. As time passed, his advances grew bolder, yet still cloaked under the false pretense of mentorship and generosity. He once gave her a small pendant, saying it was for being such a loyal girl, but when she refused to wear it, he grew cold for days, watching her like a hawk. Ebube quickly realized that silence was the only way to survive. She couldn't report him. Who would believe her? The last time she tried to speak up about Brian's behavior, she had been humiliated. And this was the man who paid everyone's salaries, who owned the roof over her head, who had the power to disappear her life with one phone call. She learned to avoid eye contact, to wear loose clothing, to keep her back to the wall at all times. But no matter what she did, he kept coming. One afternoon, he cornered her in the guest room while the rest of the house was out. His voice was a threat hidden behind a smile. "If you scream, Ebube, no one will hear you. And if you tell anyone, I will end you." That night, she lay curled up on the cold floor of the laundry room, her body aching in ways that felt foreign and cruel. She couldn't cry. The tears had long dried up. Instead, she stared blankly at the spinning ceiling fan above, listening to the rhythmic buzz like a lullaby for the broken. That was the moment something inside her snapped, not in rebellion, but in survival. She knew she was no longer safe. Not in that house. Not in her own skin. She was a child carrying a secret too heavy for her small frame, yet she had no one to help her hold it. Chief Damian walked through the halls like nothing happened, speaking to her in passing like she was just another piece of furniture. That's how it felt, like she was nothing more than a thing to be used, discarded, and silenced. And in that mansion of marble floors and golden chandeliers, she became the most invisible person in the world. Trouble always seemed to find Ebube, even when she tried to disappear. That morning, she had woken early, finished her chores before the sun rose, and quietly slipped into the pantry to prepare the family's breakfast. She was kneeling by the lower cabinet, sorting spices, when Dennis barged in shirtless, holding his phone. He smirked when he saw her. "Still acting holy," he said mockingly, crouching beside her. She froze, heart racing, knowing what might happen if anyone walked in and saw them like that. Before she could speak, Clara's voice thundered from the hallway. "Dennis? What are you doing in there?" He bolted, and moments later Clara appeared, eyes blazing. Her gaze landed on Ebube, still on her knees, and her face twisted into disgust. "You. I knew it. You can't stay away from my sons, can you? You wretched thing." Before Ebube could explain, Clara slapped her hard across the face, the force sending her backward onto the cold tile. Her ears rang, but Clara's venomous voice rang louder. "Do you think this is a brothel? Who are you trying to charm now? You were probably spreading your legs for the driver too." No one came to her defense. The cooks turned their backs. The gardener walked away. The house manager sighed and kept arranging papers. Everyone had learned never to interfere when Clara lost her temper, and Clara lost her temper most often with Ebube. That day, she was forced to kneel in the courtyard with a sign around her neck that read, "I am a disgrace to womanhood." Clara made sure the rest of the staff saw her shame. Dennis and Brian watched from the balcony, laughing and recording videos. They would probably share it with their friends later, mocking her brokenness like it was a joke. But Ebube didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had learned that tears only encourage them. She bit her tongue, clenched her fists, and endured it. In her heart, she whispered a silent prayer to God. "If you are real, please don't let this be my end." That night, Clara stormed into the maid's quarters, throwing Ebube's bag onto the floor. "Pack your things. One more mistake, and I'll send you back to the village with nothing but your shame," she snapped. But Ebube had no village, no family to run to, no one waiting for her with open arms. Her world began and ended at the edge of the Okizi estate. She picked up her bag and hugged it tightly, like a pillow shielding her from the world's hate. She had been in the mansion for over 2 years, and not once had she been seen as human. To them, she was either a problem or a threat, never a child, never a girl trying to survive. And in those moments of solitude, when the house was silent and the world was asleep, she would place a hand over her stomach, still flat at the time, and whisper, "Someday, someone will believe me. Someday, I will matter." It was the quiet nights that were the loudest. The house was unusually still. Clara and the boys had gone to a wedding party, and only a few staff remained. Ebube had just finished mopping the dining room floor when the lights flickered, and the house manager told her she could retire early. She went to the laundry room, her usual sleeping place, and lay on a thin mat with her wrapper tucked around her. She had just closed her eyes when the door creaked open. She sat up quickly. It was Chief Damian. He stood there for a moment, staring at her with an unreadable expression. Then he stepped in and locked the door behind him. "I told them all to leave tonight," he said calmly, as if he were commenting on the weather. "No one will disturb us." Her heart began to race. "Please, sir," she whispered, already knowing it would be useless. He stepped closer, crouched beside her, and placed a hand on her cheek. "You're my favorite, Ebube. You should feel honored. What happened next became a blur of pain, resistance, muffled sobs, and the feeling of her soul being dragged out of her body. She was no longer present in her own skin. Her mind detached, floating above, watching her small frame crushed under the weight of power, silence, and fear. When he was done, he stood, adjusted his shirt, and whispered, "You speak a word of this, and I'll make sure no one ever finds your body." Then he left, as if he had merely visited the kitchen. She lay there, motionless, eyes wide open in the dark. Something inside her had broken. Not just her body, but her belief in justice, in goodness, in the idea that someone somewhere might care. The silence of that room became her tomb. That was the night Ebube died inside. The following morning, she rose before the sun, washed the sheets, and scrubbed her skin until it bled, but she couldn't remove the feeling. It lingered like a shadow that clung to her soul. When Clara returned later that day, shouting about a missing earring, Ebube didn't flinch. When Brian accused her of eyeing him again, she didn't respond. She moved like a ghost through the house, working without a word, existing without feeling. Her silence made them think they had won. But beneath that silence, something else was growing. A seed, a voice, a fire. And as the weeks passed and her body began to change, tenderness in her chest, sudden dizziness, missed periods, she realized she was not alone. The same night that destroyed her had also planted something in her. A child, a purpose, and perhaps, someday a weapon. The signs became too loud to ignore. At first, Ebube thought it was just stress. Her body felt heavier, her legs ached more than usual, and her appetite vanished overnight. But when her monthly cycle skipped once, then again, panic clawed its way into her chest. She was only 14, yet her body carried a storm far beyond her years. She dared not speak of it in the mansion. The shame, the mockery, the accusations would be unbearable. Clara would tear her apart without a second thought. Still, one evening, while sent on an errand to the nearby market, she gathered enough courage to visit a small pharmacy kiosk tucked behind a shop. The woman selling medicine looked her up and down with a frown. "You're too young for this," she said. Ebube could only nod in silence, trembling as she accepted the small test strip wrapped in brown paper. That night, she waited until everyone was asleep, then crept into the servants' bathroom, knees buckling under her. When the result appeared, it confirmed what her body already knew. 2 bold lines. Positive. Her hands shook violently as she held the test strip, tears flooding her face before she even realized they were falling. She stared into the broken mirror above the sink, struggling to recognize the child reflected back at her. A child now carrying a child. She thought of her mother again, how she would have held her, how she would have told her it wasn't her fault. But her mother was long gone, and the woman in this mansion, Clara, would never be that kind of mother. Still, as dawn approached, she made the most terrifying decision of her life, to tell Chief Damian the truth. She had nothing left to protect. The lie had lived long enough. Maybe he would feel remorse. Maybe, somehow, the part of him that knew what he did would step forward and admit the truth. But when she stood before him in his study the next morning, her tiny fingers holding the test paper with trembling courage, his reaction shattered whatever hope she clung to. His eyes flared with fury, not fear, not guilt, and he rose from his seat like a viper uncoiling. "What nonsense is this?" he shouted, grabbing the test paper and tearing it in half without even looking at it. "So this is your plan? To trap me with lies? To destroy my name with your filthy womb?" He accused her of seducing the security guards, the driver, even the gardener. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think this is how poor girls rise," he sneered, the veins on his forehead pulsing with rage. Before she could utter a word in protest, he slapped her so hard her vision blurred. Then came the worst betrayal. He called Clara. "Come and see what this demon seed has done now." Minutes later, Clara stormed into the room, her face twisted with disgust, and began screaming about how she always knew Ebube would bring shame. The boys joined in, smirking at the doorway, whispering to each other, while Ebube stood in the middle, broken and defenseless. That day, there was no investigation, no hearing, no protection. Only exile. The order was swift. Throw her out. She wants to bring a bastard into my house? Over my dead body. When the mansion gates slammed shut behind her, Ebube didn't move. The gravel cut her feet as she stood there, stunned, as if her body couldn't register what had just happened. Her wrapper clung to her from the earlier rain, and her stomach twisted with both hunger and fear. Passers-by stared, some whispering, others laughing, a few shaking their heads. A child with a swollen belly, barefoot and alone. How easy it was for the world to judge. She wandered aimlessly through the streets, holding her stomach, terrified with every step. Her legs carried her, but her heart had already collapsed. That night, she found herself behind a shuttered shopfront, huddled in the shadows, with stray dogs sniffing nearby. The chill of the concrete seeped into her bones, and the rumble in her belly grew unbearable. Her child kicked for the first time. She cried, not out of fear this time, but from the aching question, "What kind of world are you coming into?" Days passed. She begged for water and chewed dry Gary given by another street child. The people she passed didn't see her. They saw only disgrace. The story had already spread. Housemaid caught sleeping around. Pregnant at 14. She heard her name in gossip whispered outside kiosks. No one asked her what really happened. No one wanted the truth. One afternoon, after collapsing beside a bush path from exhaustion, she awoke to the sound of someone calling her name. An older woman, Mama Ifyinanya, stood over her, holding a flask and a torn umbrella. She was a roadside acra seller who had seen Ebube begging days earlier. With a compassion that society had forgotten, Mama Ifyinanya lifted her gently, took her to her one-room mud home, and fed her warm pap and beans. For the first time in weeks, Ebube felt a safe hand. Under Mama Ifyinanya's care, the final days of her pregnancy passed in weary silence. The old woman had little, but what she had she gave freely. Wrappers to change into, hot water baths, soup, and the wisdom of motherhood. "Pain does not mean weakness, my daughter," she said one night, rubbing Ebube's back as the contractions started. "Sometimes pain is the sound of your strength waking up." The labor was long. Her screams pierced the night. But when the baby arrived, the moment his cries filled the air, Ebube felt something crack open inside her, a new life, not just for the child, but for herself. She named him Zakura, show the world. And as she held him, tears soaking his tiny face, she whispered a promise she would spend years trying to keep. "You will never beg for love. You will never suffer in silence like I did. You will know your name, and so will the world." Zakura grew with a kind of light that made people turn their heads. His skin was deep and rich like his mother's, but his eyes burned with a fierce intelligence that made even elders pause. From the moment he could walk, he followed Ebube to the market, to the stream, and even to Mama Ifyinanya's acra stall. Though money was always scarce, Ebube never allowed poverty to define them. She sewed torn clothes for neighbors, sold sachet water from a wheelbarrow, and later began washing uniforms for school children just to make enough for Zakura's school fees. "We don't eat till you learn," she'd tell him gently, her fingers bleeding from hand-washing laundry, but her smile never fading. She watched him memorize poems, answer complex math without pencils, and read newspapers aloud by age 8. He was her purpose, her second heartbeat, her revenge. Zakura, too, began to understand the weight of the silence around his father. "Mama, where is he?" he asked often. And each time, Ebube would stare at him with a heavy sigh, stroking his cheek before answering. "He doesn't deserve to know you." He stopped asking eventually, but the ache remained. What he lacked in paternal presence, he received tenfold in his mother's discipline. She didn't raise him to pity himself. She raised him to stand tall. She taught him to bow to no one but God, to read when others played, to respect his name because it was all he had. At night, by candlelight, they would recite court speeches she copied from old law books. "Speak your truth, Zakura," she would say, "even if your voice shakes." By the time Zakura turned 10, he was already entering essay competitions and winning. His school principal once called Ebube aside and said, "Your son is not normal. He's a phenomenon." That night, Ebube cried, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. She remembered the day she almost gave up, the day her swollen feet carried her to that gate and left her for dead. But Zakura was living proof that pain was not the end. He was becoming what they said she never could create, a legacy. And though she hadn't yet told him about Chief Damian, about the family that rejected him before his first breath, she knew the day was coming. And when it did, she would not tell him with bitterness or anger. She would place her hand on his chest and say, "This is your sword. This is your story. Go and carry it with pride." Time moved quietly in the dusty compound where Ebube raised her son, but the outside world roared with stories she tried hard to ignore. Still, no wall was high enough, no gate strong enough, to keep news from seeping in like smoke. It started with whispers at the market stalls. Chief Damian's company, once towering and untouchable, was faltering. Staff weren't being paid. There were rumors of financial mismanagement, but no one dared say his name too loudly. Clara, now more obsessed with appearances than reality, was seen online flaunting new diamond-studded purses and boarding private jets for spa retreats. Her sons, Brian and Dennis, had become familiar faces on scandal blogs, involved in nightclub brawls, online fraud accusations, and reckless spending. Each headline was another crack in a house built on pride and intimidation. Ebube would hear them, nod silently, and return to her sewing machine. But Zakura saw the headlines too. He wasn't a child anymore. He was becoming a man, and questions were beginning to shape his silence. Zakura's presence was maturing into something striking and unignorable. At 15, he had the posture of a seasoned speaker and the vocabulary of a law professor. His principal invited him to address the school's parent-teacher forum, and his speech about justice, opportunity, and forgotten children brought a crowd of hardened adults to their feet. The local radio station aired clips of it, without even knowing his full name. But one person who heard the broadcast recognized the tone, the command, and the resemblance. A retired driver who once worked at Chief Damian's mansion listened closely and whispered to his wife that he had seen those eyes before, on a girl who was thrown out of the house all those years ago. In a world addicted to spectacle, it didn't take long for dots to start connecting. Old neighbors began whispering. Someone uploaded an old photo of Ebube carrying baby Zakura while sweeping. A blogger dug into the past. Before long, speculations exploded on social media. Was Chief Damian's housemaid telling the truth all along? Ebube knew the storm was coming. She saw it in the way strangers stared at Zakura now, with a mix of wonder and suspicion. He found an anonymous letter in his locker at school that read, "Do you even know who your father is?" That evening, he confronted her, not with anger, but with quiet resolve. "Mama, you've protected me all your life. But I'm no longer a boy. You've raised me for war. Now let me know the battlefield." She looked at him, trembling, her throat tightening as decades of grief bubbled to the surface. And so she told him everything, from the laundry room to the test strip, to the night he kicked in her womb as she slept on the street. Zakura didn't interrupt. He sat still, eyes brimming, fists clenched. Then he rose, kissed her hand, and said, "You survived him. But I was born to finish what you started." That night, Ebube didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because, for the first time in her life, she believed justice wasn't a fantasy. It was standing in her kitchen, sharpening its voice. The auditorium was packed for the National Youth Justice Summit, an annual event where the brightest young minds in the legal field were invited to speak. Zakura, now 17, had been selected as one of the keynote student speakers, representing a community school from the poorest corner of the state. Standing behind the podium, dressed in a second-hand black suit Ebube had sewn to perfection, Zakura commanded the room with a confidence that startled even the top dignitaries. "Justice," he said, his voice deep and steady, "is not only what the law delivers, it is what the silence deserve." He went on to speak about the rights of domestic workers, the dangers of unchecked power, and the lifelong scars carried by girls thrown away by society. He never mentioned his mother by name, but anyone who knew, knew. The speech was posted online by a local journalist. Within hours, it went viral. Hashtags trended. Activists began asking, "Who is this boy? Who raised him?" The speech reached every corner of the country, including the living room of Chief Damian Okizi. At first, he dismissed it with a scoff. "Another loudmouth youth trying to trend," he muttered. But when the boy's face appeared on his screen, his fingers froze. There was something familiar in the jawline, the eyes, the voice. It wasn't just recognition. It was a haunting. He called Brian into the room. "Look at this boy," he said sharply. Brian stared, then shrugged. "I don't know him," he mumbled, though even he shifted uncomfortably. Clara, watching from her makeup vanity, frowned. "That's the face of that maid's child," she whispered. "The one we threw out." Panic began to stir in Damian's chest, not because he feared truth, but because he feared exposure. If the public tied this boy to him, his empire could crumble faster than it already was. He ordered his PR team to monitor the situation and instructed his lawyers to be ready just in case. But deep inside, the lie he buried years ago was unearthing itself, not with fists, but with facts. Back in the village, Ebube was overwhelmed by the media attention. Journalists were calling. NGOs were offering partnerships. Lawyers were offering representation. But Ebube, ever cautious, said nothing. She didn't want fame. She wanted justice. Zakura, however, was ready. He applied for a formal court petition against Chief Damian, not just for paternity, but for defamation, emotional abuse, and denial of inheritance. The legal process began to unfold slowly. First, the summons. Then, the media coverage. Then came the day Zakura walked into the high court premises with his mother at his side, her head held high, her gown simple but regal, her eyes clear. Cameras flashed, reporters screamed. And as they stood before the courtroom doors, Zakura turned to her and said, "You walked out his gate with nothing. Today, we walk back with the truth." The doors opened, and the battle began. The courtroom was a cathedral of silence and scrutiny. Every seat was filled, not just with legal minds, but with citizens hungry for truth. Some remembered the scandal from years ago. Others had only known whispers. But now everything was public. Chief Damian arrived in a polished black suit, flanked by his legal team and 2 bodyguards. He walked with the same air of arrogance that once made him untouchable. But even the richest armor cannot hide fear when it is born of guilt. Across the aisle sat Zakura, calm, dressed in a navy blue suit tailored by a local seamstress. Beside him was Ebube, dignified, her headscarf tied like a crown. For the first time in years, they faced the man who destroyed their lives. But this time, they didn't come to beg. They came to speak. The case was formally entered. Zakura Ebube versus Chief Damian Okizi, with claims of paternity, defamation, abandonment, and reputational damage. Chief Damian's lawyers immediately objected, claiming the boy was trying to extort their client for fame and money. They submitted false witness statements, claiming that Ebube had been promiscuous, even as a child. Videos were shown out of context. Old staff were paid off to testify that Ebube had seduced everyone. The courtroom buzzed with discomfort. But then Zakura rose. With the confidence of a seasoned attorney, he addressed the court himself under special provision. "If I am not his son, let science decide," he said, submitting a court-ordered paternity test request. The judge approved it. Damian objected again, but public pressure had grown too loud. Too many people were watching. Too many knew the truth. Back home, Ebube received a knock at her door that evening. A strange man in a suit handed her a brown envelope. Inside was a note, unsigned, offering a large sum of money if they agreed to drop the case. "You've made your point. Now disappear," it read. The next morning, she received a second envelope, this time with pictures of her home, Zakura's school, and her workplace. A veiled threat. She trembled. Fear tried to crawl back in. But Zakura was already a step ahead. He contacted the police and filed a formal threat report. News outlets were alerted. And in a televised interview, Zakura addressed the threats. "You silenced my mother once. You will not silence me. We didn't come for your money. We came for the truth. And the gavel is coming." The morning news exploded with headlines carefully crafted to bury the truth. Gold digger resurfaces to blackmail business icon. One read. Another said, disgraced former maid and her son accused of plotting high-level scam. Chief Damian's media machine had been activated in full force. Paid bloggers began circulating edited photos of Ebube, blurry images from her May days that made her look unkempt and reckless. Some even falsely claimed she had been caught sleeping with multiple workers, one going as far as suggesting that the father of her child could be anyone from the gate man to the chef. Online trolls, armed with anonymous accounts, flooded the internet with insults. She's just bitter. Looking for her 15 minutes. Where was she all these years? Even Zakura, once hailed for his brilliance, was now branded a product of shame. A liar raised by a liar, they typed, without remorse. The strategy was simple. Drown them in dirt so no one would care about the truth. Chief Damian had perfected the art of distraction. While Zakura prepared legal documents and Ebube gathered witnesses, Damian poured millions into reshaping public opinion. He appeared on primetime television with a paid host, shedding crocodile tears. I have worked all my life with integrity, he said dramatically, placing a hand on his chest. I do not know this boy. I pity him. I believe someone is using him to destroy my legacy. The crowd applauded. Clara stood behind him, draped in pearls, nodding with the performance of a seasoned actress. People will do anything for money these days, she added, sneering. The strategy worked temporarily. Some members of the public, especially those who worshipped wealth, began doubting Ebube's motives. She began receiving calls from former friends, warning her to drop the case. You're poking a lion, one woman said. He will ruin you. But Ebube, though shaken, refused to be silenced again. She had spent too many years drowning in their silence. She would not let them control her voice now. Zakura responded not with noise, but with power. He held a press conference, brief, poised, and striking. Standing behind a podium with his mother beside him, he addressed the nation. We are not here to destroy anyone. We are here to uncover truth. The kind of truth that has buried too many poor women like my mother in shame. He paused, then continued. If you believe that wealth protects a man from accountability, ask yourself what kind of justice system we are living in. The video trended faster than Damian's media spin. Feminist groups rallied around Ebube. Human rights lawyers offered to join the case pro bono. Stories of other maids who were silenced began to surface. One woman, now in her 30s, came forward with her own horrifying story of abuse in a different mansion, but one eerily similar. The tide was turning. The billionaire's media smoke was thick, but Zakura's truth was fire. And smoke cannot stand before fire for long. The threats escalated from veiled warnings to open terror. One evening, Ebube returned home to find the small kitchen window broken, and a note pinned to the door with a knife. The paper read, "Back off, or bury your son." Her knees buckled. She clutched the doorframe and stared in disbelief, heart racing, sweat breaking across her brow despite the evening chill. Zakura arrived minutes later to find her sitting silently on the floor, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The note crumpled in her fist. His hands trembled as he read it. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was war. He called the police immediately, but even they seemed hesitant. "Madam, are you sure you're not provoking someone powerful?" one officer asked, a smirk hiding behind his uniform. It was a bitter reminder that even institutions meant to protect could be bought. That night, Ebube didn't sleep. She held Zakura's hand as if it were a lifeline, staring at the ceiling, whispering the same prayer over and over. God, don't let them kill my child. Not after everything. But Zakura was no longer the boy curled up beside her in a one-room home. He was a lawyer now, forged in fire, raised by a woman who taught him how to endure. The next morning, he submitted a restraining order to the court and filed a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. He also made the threat public. In a bold move, he released a video addressing the danger. Last night, someone threatened to kill me and my mother. This isn't just a legal battle anymore. This is a system trying to silence victims again. But we will not bow. The video gained millions of views. Even those who doubted before began to take notice. Activists rallied. Online campaigns spread like wildfire. The threat had backfired, because people now saw the truth through fear. And Ebube, though shaken, stood beside her son during every interview, refusing to wear sunglasses, refusing to hide her face. "If they want to kill me for speaking, then let them come," she said. "But I won't die with my mouth shut." Chief Damian, sensing the walls closing in, grew more desperate. He called in favors, held secret meetings, and even tried to bribe Zakura's school director to revoke his legal license. But every move he made was countered, because Zakura had done his homework. Every threat was documented. Every bribe attempt was recorded. And more damaging still, former staff who once worked in the mansion were beginning to talk. A former housekeeper reached out anonymously, saying she witnessed Clara slap Ebube on multiple occasions and once overheard Damian threatening the girl. But she had stayed silent for years out of fear. Now, emboldened by Zakura's courage, she offered to testify. Others followed. The courtroom wasn't just a place for law anymore. It was a battlefield. And every voice that had once been silenced was now returning like thunder. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but the echoes of justice were already shaking the ground. The courtroom was a sea of tension as the day of the paternity hearing arrived. News cameras crowded the outer gate, while inside, the atmosphere throbbed with anticipation. This was no longer a personal dispute. It had become a national reckoning. Ebube sat on the left side of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly together, Zakura at her side like a shield of dignity. Opposite them, Chief Damian sat with his head held high, a smug grin curving his lips. His lawyers had submitted thick files of so-called evidence, character assassination reports, old statements from bribe staff, and one fraudulent medical report suggesting Ebube had once had an abortion. But Zakura was ready. His legal team moved with precision. The judge ordered all irrelevant documents to be removed, reminding the courtroom, "This case is about identity. Let the blood speak." When the paternity results were handed to the bailiff, silence gripped the room like a clenched fist. The judge opened the envelope, adjusted her glasses, and began to read, after conducting DNA analysis between the petitioner, Zakura Ebube, and the respondent, Chief Damian Okizi. The result shows a 99.9% genetic match. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Some clapped. Others wept. Ebube covered her face, shoulders trembling, not out of shame, but relief. It was over. The world knew. Zakura, calm but fierce, stood and turned toward Chief Damian. "You said I wasn't your son. Science says otherwise. Now the law will answer the rest." Damian's face twisted into something unrecognizable, rage, confusion, and fear all fighting for space. Clara stood, grabbed her purse, and stormed out. She didn't wait for her husband. For the first time, her silence was louder than her voice. But the courtroom wasn't finished. Zakura's legal team submitted the next request: inheritance rights, financial reparations for defamation, and an official correction of public records. Damian's team scrambled, but the judge nodded. "All petitions will proceed," she said. The battle of names had begun. And this time, it wasn't just about being acknowledged. It was about claiming what was stolen, not only wealth, but dignity. Outside the courthouse, a journalist shoved a mic in Ebube's face. "How do you feel, madam?" She paused, looked at her son, then at the sky. "He tried to bury me with shame, but I planted it, and it grew into justice." Zakura placed his hand on her shoulder, and together they walked through the crowd, not as victims, but as victors reclaiming everything their silence once cost them. Inside Chief Damian's private study, once a command center of influence, now a bunker of desperation, the billionaire paced with clenched fists and a face drained of its usual arrogance. The news of the DNA confirmation had spread like wildfire. Investors were pulling out, stockholders were demanding answers, and social media had erupted with support for Ebube and her son. Hashtag Zakura is his son, and hashtag Justice for Ebube trended for days. But Damian was not a man accustomed to losing. He believed in power, not accountability. So he made what he believed to be a genius move: transfer all his business assets and company shares to Brian and Dennis, his publicly acknowledged heirs. "Let them come for me," he hissed at his lawyers, "but they'll never touch what I've built." His team of strategists quickly filed the paperwork, rushed legal signings, and called for an emergency board meeting. During a televised press conference, Damian stood beside his sons, declaring he was retiring for health reasons and passing the company reins to his children as a legacy of excellence. On the surface, the announcement seemed like a clever move. The public saw a man stepping aside gracefully, despite the controversy, and giving the younger generation a chance to lead. But those who had followed the case closely could see through the act. The timing was too perfect. The legal pressure too intense. It wasn't retirement, it was evasion. Behind closed doors, Brian and Dennis weren't celebrating. They were panicking. They had lived their entire lives in the shadow of their father's name, reveling in his wealth, but never truly understanding the responsibility that came with it. Now, with the company under their names, they were exposed. Investors were skeptical. The board was divided. And neither boy had the credibility to lead. But Damian reassured them. "This is only temporary," he said. "Once the dust settles, I'll take everything back." Zakura, however, was already 3 steps ahead. He and his legal team filed for an emergency injunction, arguing that the asset transfer was fraudulent and done with malicious intent to evade court rulings. The court agreed to pause the execution of the transfer until a full hearing could be held. But Zakura didn't stop there. He also demanded a financial audit of the company, citing abuse of power, corruption, and mismanagement. Activists and watchdog organizations backed the motion. And as the court moved swiftly under intense public scrutiny, Damian's empire shield began to splinter. The man who had once thrown a girl out in the rain without mercy was now scrambling to protect the fortune he built off lies and exploitation. And standing on the other side of that battlefield was that very girl, now a woman, not with weapons, but with truth, law, and the son she had raised with nothing but strength. The day the DNA test results for Brian and Dennis arrived, the courthouse was filled to the brim, not with curiosity, but with tension so sharp it could cut glass. The judge, stern and methodical, held the 2 sealed envelopes like a surgeon holding scalpels. No one spoke. Not Clara. Not Damian. Not even the court reporter. The silence was suffocating. The petitions had been filed by Zakura's legal team, based on increasing evidence that neither of Damian's sons shared any biological resemblance to him. Zakura had stood firmly, stating, "If I had to prove myself, let them do the same." Though it seemed outrageous at first, whispers had started leaking, rumors from former staff, mysterious bills for out-of-town medical visits Clara took during her pregnancies, and an overheard confession from an ex-friend who claimed Clara had been in a long-term affair. Now it all stood to be confirmed, not in secrets or slander, but in science. The judge opened the first envelope. The result of the DNA test between Mr. Damian Okizi and Mr. Brian Okizi shows no biological relationship. The room exploded. Cameras flashed. Reporters gasped. Clara turned pale, her face cracking under the weight of humiliation. Before the echo died, the judge proceeded to the second envelope. The result of the DNA test between Mr. Damian Okizi and Mr. Dennis Okizi also shows no biological relationship. Gasps turned to murmurs. Brian stood up. "Mummy? What's she saying?" Dennis began shaking. Damian sat motionless. His world, the dynasty he claimed to protect, was built on a lie he didn't even know existed. Clara, lips trembling, stood and shouted, "This is madness. Those tests were rigged." But the judge slammed the gavel and demanded order. What Clara didn't know was that additional independent labs had already verified the results. The truth was undeniable. Damian collapsed into a seat, a man unmade. The empire he had so viciously guarded had turned to ash in his hands. The company he tried to shield was now legally frozen, and the sons he placed his future in were not even his own. His wife, once his pillar of pride, had betrayed him more deeply than he had ever imagined. But perhaps the most poetic pain came from the one person he spent a lifetime trying to destroy, the son he denied. Zakura sat there unmoved, hands folded in front of him. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply looked at Damian with quiet finality, then turned to the judge and said, "The truth of the blood is not revenge. It is revelation. We are not fighting for wealth. We are fighting to erase the shame that was never ours to begin with." And with that, the court announced that a full restructuring of Damian's estate would be reviewed. The gavel fell, but the sound was not of punishment. It was of prophecy fulfilled. With the results exposed and Damian's reputation in ruins, the board of directors called for an emergency restructuring of the TOCHI Corporation. Investors who had pulled out earlier now returned, not because they wanted to back Damian, but because Zakura's integrity and intelligence had impressed the business world. The court appointed him as interim trustee pending the final hearings on asset reallocation. Zakura refused a personal payout. Instead, he offered a proposal to convert part of the company into a trust that would fund legal aid for domestic workers and underage abuse victims. "We cannot erase what this company did," he said, addressing the board, "but we can transform what it stands for." The board voted unanimously in his favor. For the first time in decades, the TOCHI name stood for justice, not exploitation. And the one who carried that justice was the boy once called a bastard, raised by the woman they had called a curse. Chief Damian was left with nothing but a few private properties, and whatever silence remained in his once mighty name. Clara vanished from the public eye, rumored to be hiding abroad. Brian and Dennis, humiliated and disinherited, faced investigation for financial fraud during their short time managing the company. The mansion, that cold palace where Ebube had once scrubbed floors and begged for mercy, was put up for auction. Journalists gathered as buyers toured the property, marveling not at the gold ceilings, but at the haunting silence that now lived in every hallway. Ebube refused to enter it again. When the auctioneer offered her first bid rights, she shook her head. "My crown was never in that house," she said softly. "It was always here," she added, placing her hand over her heart. Now in her early 30s, Ebube walked with quiet grace. Her hair braided simply, her voice soft but unwavering. She stood beside Zakura as he signed his first formal company reform policy. She didn't crave cameras or praise. She only wanted the truth to live. And it did not in buildings, but in the courage of those who spoke when they were told to be silent. In the aftermath, a journalist asked her, "Do you feel vindicated?" She replied, "I don't need revenge. I have redemption." And as she turned to leave, holding Zakura's hand, the world saw not just a woman who had been thrown out of a gate, but a queen who walked through fire and came back with a crown of truth, and a son who carried her legacy like a sword that no lie could bend. In a dimly lit room at the back of a modest estate on the outskirts of the city, Chief Damian sat alone. His once flawless marble floors were now replaced with cracked tiles. The leather chairs he once flaunted had been auctioned off. The room smelled of dust and defeat. A single television screen played news segments about the very company he once ruled, now thriving under new leadership. Zakura's name appeared often, not as a reminder of shame, but as a symbol of hope. Each word spoken in praise of the boy felt like a dagger. Damian barely recognized himself anymore. No staff, no guards, no Clara, no sons, only silence. The wealth he used to bury the truth had crumbled. The mansion he once built to tower above others now belonged to the very system he tried to cheat. It was a poetic ending, but one that tasted bitter. In his arrogance, he believed himself a god among men. But gods do not beg for relevance, and now even the papers had stopped mentioning his name. When the letter came, sealed in a clean white envelope, he stared at it for a long time before opening it. It wasn't from the court. It wasn't a demand letter or a threat. It was a request from him. Chief Damian had written it himself to Zakura. 3 pages, handwritten in uneven strokes. The words were not polished or rehearsed. They were desperate. He begged for a meeting. He asked for understanding. He tried to explain how fear drove him, how power made him blind. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Perhaps he knew better than to expect it. But he asked to see Zakura, even for 5 minutes, before the world swallowed him whole. "I don't know what kind of father I would have been," he wrote, "but you turned out better than I ever could have made you. You carry the name I disgraced, and you wear it better than I ever did." He sealed it, sent it by courier, and waited. For once, he waited without control. For once, he was just a man hoping for a reply. Zakura received the letter a few days later. He read it once, then again. His hand shook not from rage, but from the ache of something deeper, the ache of knowing that the man who brought him into this world had done everything to pretend he didn't exist, and now wanted an audience after losing everything. He showed the letter to his mother. Ebube stared at it silently, then looked up at her son. "Do you want to see him?" she asked. Zakura paused. "I don't need to," he said quietly. "I don't hate him, but I won't give him the final word." Instead, he wrote a reply, not to Damian, but to the world. In a published editorial titled "The Legacy of Truth," he spoke about the importance of speaking up, protecting the vulnerable, and dismantling the systems that reward silence. It ended with one line that echoed louder than any rejection. "We don't always get the apologies we deserve, but we can build futures where no one ever needs to beg for one." The gala hall was filled with lights, cameras, and quiet reverence as Ebube took to the stage to accept the National Human Dignity Award, the highest civilian honor for advocacy in human rights. She walked slowly, her simple dress flowing like water, her eyes calm but fiery. The applause lasted several minutes, not because she was famous, but because she had become a symbol. A woman who had no voice at 14 now stood before the nation as a lighthouse for thousands. As she stood at the podium, her hands trembled slightly. "I was once called a curse," she began, her voice soft but unwavering, "because the world didn't know what to do with a girl who refused to stay silent." She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply told the truth about power, injustice, and survival. She ended with a smile and turned towards Zakura, who was now seated among dignitaries. "And to my son, thank you for believing in my truth when the world refused to hear it. You gave me back my name." The applause that followed wasn't just admiration. It was an acknowledgement from mothers, fathers, daughters, survivors, and lawmakers. Zakura rose and joined his mother on stage, holding her hand like he had done so many times before. Together, they raised their joined hands in quiet triumph. Their story had begun in the dirt, beneath the shadow of gates that closed too soon. But it ended on a stage built from resilience, with lights that no one could turn off. The foundation they had started together, the Ebube Justice Project, now provided legal aid for abandoned children, protection for domestic workers, and education scholarships for girls accused of witchcraft or shamed by circumstance. Their fight had birthed a movement, and in every state, the name Ebube had become a chant for strength. Not just the name of a woman, but the meaning of her story. Miracle. Later that night, as they sat together on the rooftop of a quiet hotel overlooking the city, Ebube placed her head on Zakura's shoulder and whispered, "Do you remember the first time I told you about your father?" He nodded. "Yes. You said he tried to break you, but he only gave you a reason to rise." She smiled, eyes glistening. "And now you've given others that reason too." The wind blew gently, and the stars sparkled above them. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Their silence no longer held pain. It held peace. And as the night stretched on, one truth became clear. She had been thrown out not because she was cursed, but because she carried a truth too powerful to be hidden. And now, that truth had come back with a gavel, and changed the world. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.